Well, you're very welcome to the launch of Niamh Fitzpatrick's first book, Tell Me the Truth About Loss. It's a pre-recorded event in partnership with Gill Books and with Eason, and Niamh is going to be answering your questions live on her Twitter page shortly after the event finishes. And you can use the hashtag Tell Me the Truth About Loss to submit your question, and she promises that she will answer as many as is possible. As you will know, people across Ireland came together to offer their sympathies and sorrow at the news of the crash of Rescue 116 back on the 14th of March 2017. There were 4 crew members on the Sikorsky S-92 that night. They flew out over the sea to provide assistance to Rescue 118 and to rescue somebody in trouble, and they never came home. Dara's sister, Niamh Fitzpatrick, has been a psychologist for almost 3 decades, and she has written this memoir, which touches on loss and grief and the difficulties that people, almost all people, at some point experience in their lives. And Niamh has made a donation from the proceeds of this book to the Irish Hospice Foundation as a thank you to all of the work that they have done in supporting people through the pain of loss. I'm joined today by Niamh and by 2 men she has worked with very closely over the years. Stephen Rochford, the former Mayo senior football manager, who is now, of course, in the backroom team of the Donegal senior football team, and Liam Griffin, the former All-Ireland winning Wexford senior hurling manager. A success he, of course, attributes entirely to the work of Niamh Fitzpatrick. He, of course, was named one of the most successful men in GAA history. Both men are involved in sport, both men are involved in business, and we'll be talking about loss in various different forms that people will experience both in those areas and in others. But before we get into all of that, I want to touch a little bit on the book and give you a bit of a sense of the book. So what I might ask Niamh is, if you would you mind just giving us the first paragraph from Tell Me the Truth About Loss?
I have learned an important truth. Grief is not just about death, it's about change and what we lose when things change. It's the old life that we knew gone forever and a new one in its place. We can encounter grief in many different situations, and it's important to give ourselves permission to grieve for all such losses, to accept the necessity of grief as part of the healing and recovery process. There are many different types of loss throughout life. Perhaps your loss is the death of someone you love. Maybe it's the end of a relationship or the realization that you'll never be a parent. It could be a life-altering medical condition, a miscarriage, or an accident that sees you having to say goodbye to the life you once knew or to the hopes you had for the future. Whatever it is, any loss can be a cause of grief. I've experienced the loss of my sister, the loss of my marriage, and the loss of my plan to be a mother.
I want to talk about with Liam and with Stephen about the different types of loss that people experience. Before we get into that though, can you tell us a little bit just about Dara? Because obviously while you say there was a confluence of events that you had to deal with that period, prime amongst them was the loss of Dara.
She was amazing. She, somebody who dies, you're not going to say awful things about them, but she was truly amazing. She was just one of life's good people. Liam knew her for years. And so I was 3 years older than Dara, and she was this little imp. She was this little cheeky little imp with a dimple and a big cheesy smiley grin. And she made us all hold funerals for budgies and goldfish in the house, and if you didn't attend the funeral, you were in big trouble. And she was kind, and she didn't like stew, so my mother used to give her stew and tell her it was a casserole, and she would eat it. And I suppose there's 5 siblings, and we became friends. So Dara wasn't just my sister, she was my friend. And there's 4 girls and a boy, and so the 4 girls, I suppose, were very tight and close. So in teenage years, that little imp became the pal, in adult years the pal, and she was properly one of life's good people.
You talk in the book about the Kubler-Ross model for dealing with death and dying. Have you progressed through it? Is it easier to talk about Dara now, or is it still as raw?
It's easier to talk about her now, but that brings its own pain. We have some interviews and things to do for this book. Obviously, I was shopping a week ago I'm no good at the clothes thing, so I got a stylist who came with me and we did a socially distanced session, and I found this dress for one event And it was a beautiful dress, a really beautiful dress. And the first thing that came into my head, because when I put it on, we all knew it was my dress. And the first thing that came into my head was that Dara Fitz was here with me. And I just burst into tears. And I'm okay on things like this, maybe because of my training on your show years ago, in the psychology piece. I'm okay there. But the feelings, the grief, the waves of grief come maybe at times when I'm not on duty, if you like. But in some ways, being able to be here and to talk about her without crying is great, but that brings its own pain, because I think when you're grieving, you want that pain, you need that connection. How can I be okay? How can Dara be dead and I be okay to talk about her without crying? There's a guilt almost with that.
Which, of course, is one of the interesting things about Tell Me the Truth About Loss, is the fact that it is not only your personal story, but it is the personal story of somebody whose professional life is helping others process emotions. So to see your experience of it and to see, is it made any easier by being a professional? It's an intriguing one on that front. We'll get deeper into it. First, Niamh, I should ask about her. We mentioned her professional capacity. Worked as a psychologist with the All-Ireland winning Wexford team back with you in the day. How did you come across Niamh originally?
Well...
Be kind.
Sorry?
Be kind.
I will be kind. I will have to be kind. I suppose if you look at it, you know, sports psychology wasn't big at that time in GA particularly. Like, you know, it wasn't for real men, you know what I mean? It was taboo. But when I was young, I played, and I was very slight. But I always reckoned that mentally, you know, especially if you come on at a young age into teams, you don't have the kind of mental side. Like in my time, I remember guys in dressing rooms breaking hurleys off the wall and shouting and screaming. And I remember playing minor for Wexford, and some man talked about 98, and I thought, what's this got to do with what we're doing? So I just felt that the mental side was very important. So I went and seek somebody on the mental side. And that wouldn't have been popular even with players at that stage. But we'd done a lot of bits on the mental side. But eventually, I actually arranged to speak to 3 different people. And I spoke to Niamh, and this was really trying now for macho men. We were going to have a sports psychologist, but it was going to be a woman as well. But anyway, when I met Niamh, the thing that struck me about her most of all was that she had great emotional intelligence. And I just felt she really had that. She knew nothing about hurling, and that's what I wanted. I didn't want her to know anything about hurling, because the male side, there was one particular guy who was a great guy, but he was telling me he had some great ideas for hurling. And it wasn't that you'd have anything against him for that, but the fact that he might think then that he would start to make influence on what you were going to do. And we had a specific task for everybody, and we needed somebody on this side. So I just thought Niamh was the right person. And I think she was going to be challenging for the lads as well, and she was going to be very good with them. And by the way, to this day, she's spoken about very highly with all the players. And only for Niamh, my honest belief, and I believe it, you won't win an All-Ireland unless the team are good enough. But the backroom team has to be good too, and I think she played a major part.
Well, I think it's an interesting parallel, because it comes across in the book. There is a difference in the engagement with Wexford and with the Mayo football team, because in the first it was obviously very passionate and committed, but it was a professional engagement. In the second, you get the sense from the book, Stephen, that Niamh working with you was in some part as good for Niamh as it was for you. If I can just read you the passage that relates to her invitation to work with Mayo. I'd only been to Mayo perhaps once or twice in my life until Dara died, but in the intervening weeks I had become very familiar with the road west. The people of Mayo had been so good to us. They welcomed us into their county and minded us even in the darkest times. They sent emails offering beds in their houses when we were travelling to Mayo. They told us that Fionn could play with their young children if he was up there, and he wanted a bit of normality for him. The communities of Belmullet and Blacksod and the surrounding areas wrapped us up in kindness and care from the first moment they met us. Now, the manager of the county's senior football team was seeking my professional skills, and the first thing that I thought was that this could be a chance to give back to these people, to use my professional skill set to help this county whose supporters are fanatical about their football and wanted so much to win an All-Ireland title. What made you get in touch with Niamh, Steve?
Well, firstly, I suppose coming out of 2016, we'd lost an All-Ireland, and as Liam has alluded to there, you need to have all the parts together. And we had a gap in our management team. And really, I suppose, how did it whittle down to Niamh is a little bit around, I didn't want to rush into the decision. Did a bit of research around, I didn't want to pick somebody that had been maybe with a competing team. I didn't want that. I wanted somebody with real credibility. And Niamh had that in abundance in relation to her sports psych element away from Gaelic football. And that really was one of the first things that shone to me. The experience with the Olympic teams, you know, individuals and teams. Her professional insofar as the clinical psychologist element to it. And I knew that having those bits would also be great for me, because I needed somebody within the management setup that I could open up to, direct me, how do I do this? And having one of my own do that wasn't going to give me enough balance to sort of say, there's a decision to be made here, and sort of just check me along the way.
And were you worried at all? Because everybody would have been very familiar with the tragedy, given that it happened at Black Sod or off Black Sod. Would that have caused you to be wary to approach Niamh?
A yes and a no. Not for me particularly. All right, I suppose Niamh was on my radar pre the 14th of March, and we were in the middle of a National League campaign, and you know, then wasn't the right time. So either the good or bad elements of social media allowed me to reach out. I didn't have a number, so we direct messages over Twitter, say, could we have a chat? And we had a phone call at that time, and we said we'd meet. And we had one of the great days that we had in Carton House. We spent what was maybe an hour, maybe 3 hours, ended up, and we just went from there. It just took off, and it meandered, that conversation. But I think from the off, we struck a relationship, and the one thing I've sort of learned is that being in management, and no matter what we were going through here, it's about relationships, it's about supporting each other, and ups and downs in that. And Niamh was on song for us, and it just struck the right chord, and I never spoke to anybody else afterwards. And we had bad days coming out of Carton House for no reason of the hotel by any means, but that was a really important meeting that we had, and it was up all the way from there.
And did you hesitate at all, Niamh? Because it was a decision to commit very fully to going back to the totality of your professional life. Were you concerned?
No. I had gone to Carton House thinking, I will meet this man, because he sent me a DM on Twitter and said, I'm Stephen Rochford, manager of the Mayo senior football team. And I sent him back, I know who you are. And so we chatted, and then when we met, but in my own head I said, because this was maybe 6 or 7 weeks after Dara died, and I was only just going back to work. I had literally just started being able to have a conversation without crying, I suppose. I was able to think of other people, not just myself. And I decided going there that what I would do is I'd chat to this fella. I'd see what he was like. I'd say to him, I'm going to take a few days to think about this. If he offered me something, and then I would come back to him. He hadn't got the sentence out of his mouth, and I had yes. It was, I mean, the link actually, these two men, they're very different men, but in terms of that relationship and working together, they reminded me of each other. And I think that space when you're a psychologist with a team, when you're helping manage, composure, focus, confidence, bouncing back from errors, all of those kind of things, it needs to be a strong relationship with the players. But before that, it must be a strong relationship with the manager. So I suppose I had that relationship with Stephen straight off. But then there was this thing that you've talked about there with Mayo and with these people. And I don't doubt for one moment that if that helicopter had crashed anywhere off any other county in Ireland, that we would have had the same kind of warmth. My mother described it as like a hug from Ireland, but it was Mayo that had helped us. And I suppose here was a time in all my years in psychology, it was the first time a Mayo manager had come looking for me. So that yes was one of the easiest yeses.
Did you have any concern as a psychologist that it would be an attempt to suppress emotions or distract from processing what must have still been very raw for you at the time?
Because my marriage ended around the same time that Dara died, I went to see a psychologist. Grief is not an illness. We don't need to pathologise it. Many people will go through losses in their life without needing to talk to somebody professionally. But the cumulative loss around my marriage and everything that went with that meant, and even maybe how Dara died and the trauma of that and some of the images of that were in my head, I needed to talk to somebody. So I found a psychologist, Mark Smith. He was excellent clinical psychologist, and I continued to see him my whole way through working really that year. And even now I pop in and out for sessions with him. So I knew I was minded, and I knew I was ready then to mind and care for other people, if you like.
Can I ask you about the trauma of the discovery? Because one of the things that I was reflecting on when I read it, you describe how you discovered that the Rescue 116 was missing, and you described how you conveyed it to your mum. And in both instances, I think it was as brief as the heli has gone down. Does that make it easier when it's not sugar-coated? Does it make it more difficult? Is there a good way to break that kind of news to somebody?
In my opinion, yes. What I was thinking of in those few seconds when I heard that the helicopter was down and talking to my mother, the only thing I was thinking about was get to it quickly. Because if you start a preamble with something like that, the person the other end of that phone is going to start to create or fill in the space in their head. I needed to just tell her what it was and get her straight over here to us. I lived 4 houses away from Dara, and so we needed to get her over to us and the rest of our family over to us. So my advice to anybody in that situation is know who you're dealing with, obviously, and know the context. But actually, you're not going to help them if you say to them, are you sitting down? Is somebody with you? That doesn't help. Just get straight to it and say it, and that's what I did.
You describe how this was 6 o'clock in the morning, you were just awake, you were bleary as were the rest of the family. At that point, did you hold out hope? Did you have the sense that maybe Dara would be okay?
I think we always knew. I think I knew. I think in my head, when you hear, I've been in the helicopter with Dara. She's winched me off 20 years ago. You wouldn't do it now, but she's winched me off the helicopter onto a trawler in Galway Bay. And, I've heard her, I can hear her. If I close my eyes, I can hear her voice to air traffic control. I know all that, I know what it's like being in the helicopter. And when you hear that a helicopter is down, even in that moment, it just doesn't feel like it's anything that's going to be good. And so I would say the hope was minimal, but maybe we didn't know what we were dealing with. And at one stage, I remember going upstairs to Dara's room just to get some peace and quiet for a few moments because the house was busy. I texted you that morning. Some of the poor people that we know, we didn't want them hearing on the news. And so I remember texting Liam and saying, the heli's down, Dara's on it, please pray. And so you hope. But I remember going upstairs to Dara's room just to get some peace and quiet for a second. And her bed was as she had left it. And I just pulled the covers back and just made the bed, put her bedclothes under the pillow. And there was a book sitting there that I had given her, and the book was Linwood Barclay, No Time for Goodbye. And I think that's the moment really where it caught me, because I thought, that's what this is. We've had no time for goodbye, but that's actually what we're probably heading into. And I think you know it.
What was your reaction, Liam, when you got that text?
Well, I live beside the sea, and we've lifeboats in Rosslare, and over the years been lots of dramas and lots of people lost their lives and so forth. People you know lost their lives, and lifeboat crew to be friends with, and you'd be aware of them going away to sea, and you'd know all about it. But like I remember being numb. I remember really thinking, my God, she's gone. The helicopter's gone down. She's definitely gone. And then you hear there's a body and that somebody's been recovered, and you're hoping then against hope that she had all the life gear on her, which she had, and that she was floating and that she might have been picked up. But deep down you're thinking, God love them all. She must be gone. And I knew Dara. So, and she's a beautiful girl and a great personality. And you talk about all the good things about Dara. Well, you're a carbon copy, by the way. So from from that point of view, it was a massive shock because I knew and liked Niamh so much that obviously you're suffering for her as well.
At what point, Niamh, did you begin to process it? Because I think one of the things the Irish tend to do very well is the business of funerals and bereavement, with wakes and with removals and everything else, and particularly in the instance of Dara, because I remember being at that funeral and seeing the lines of Dublin Fire Brigade, of the Coast Guard officers and crew. It was a huge demonstration of emotion, but it must have swept you along for a number of days. At what point do you begin to actually really deal with it?
I think that first year, in all honesty, was a numbness. I think walking that day at the funeral, walking back down the aisle after the crematorium, walking back down the aisle, I describe it as being, we were walking down the aisle, but you're really walking towards a life without Dara. And in that whole week, there are people who aren't normally with you. There are things that don't normally happen. It's busy, it's the admin of grief, there's all of these things to do, and you're so numb. And I think that our bodies make us numb because it's too big to take on board all at once. And so slowly it starts to let you see she's never coming back, she's never coming back. And so I think that day of the crematorium, when there wasn't anything else to do, and in terms of the admin of grief, there was a piece that night, somebody said to me, what helped you that night? Nothing helped me that night because I just kept thinking she's not coming back. And then maybe the day after Dara's funeral, I went to Mayo. Maybe 2 days after Dara's funeral, I went to Mayo, or the day actually after her funeral, I went to the base, the helicopter base, to pick up her phone from her locker, and walking into that base and seeing her car in the hangar and seeing her, there's a cubby hole with a space where her helmet was and her name is underneath it. And I sat in her car and they let me sit in her car, and there's her hand cream and there's her hair bobbins and there's all those bits and pieces that we all have. Those things help you see that she's never coming back. But really that first year, I think it was year 2 when I started to really realize it.
And of course, there's an added difficulty is the wrong phrase, but there's an added challenge and layer to dealing with the grief, in that Dara's little boy, Fionn, was around. And that means that I assume you must keep talking about Dara and you must field his questions. How do you deal with that? How do you help a child through that?
I think you have to meet the child wherever the child is at. So in terms of the age of the child, in terms of the understanding of the child, in terms of the relationship with the child to whoever it is who has died. And so, that's very hard. All of that's very hard because you're trying to manage your own grief. And we don't need to hide grief from children. They need to see it. They need to know, because otherwise a child will wonder, well, I have all these feelings of loss for somebody, but I see these adults around me and they look fine, so what do I do with all these feelings? So it's that balance of helping the child see your grief, but in a way that's appropriate. And again, with the conversations in ways that are appropriate, but it's very difficult.
Can I ask you a question about the writing of Tell Me the Truth About Loss? Because obviously I have known for some time that you were writing the book, and I assumed that the book was going to be about the loss of Dara. It goes beyond that. You quoted the paragraph at the start. You are very open and very honest about the 2 additional griefs, as you described them, the loss of your marriage and the loss of your belief that you would become a mother. Why did you include them, and how difficult was it to include them?
I included them, I think, because I was writing the truth about loss. And the truth about it is that it isn't just about death. As I grieved and grieved Dara, I began to realise that I knew these feelings, that they were familiar, that years before, when we had been unsuccessful through adoption and IVF in terms of having a family, I recognised that I knew these feelings. So grief isn't just about sadness, it's about rage, it's about loneliness, it's about resentment and so many other things. And I realised that I recognised those feelings, and it was only in mourning Dara that I realised that years beforehand I had grieved too. And I suppose probably being authentic, I could have left all that out. I thought about leaving all that out. It would have been easier to leave that out. but it just didn't feel authentic, and that's the honest. And if you think of COVID now, you know, there are over 1,700 people in Ireland who have lost their lives with COVID. But there's grief, huge grief around that. But there's also huge grief around the myriad losses with COVID. And that's why I wanted to help people understand that grief is not just about death, it's about loss.
You do make a point where you talk about Dara's death, where you say that part of what made it particularly difficult was that it might have been easier had it been the kind of illness where you can say your goodbyes and there is a process to it. With the IVF, was that easier because of that? Because I assume you begin to think, my chances are diminishing and it's a gradual realization, or is that in some ways worse than something that's an immediate shock?
And I suppose I don't know the answer to that one. I haven't quite figured that one out. In that I don't know if it's easier if somebody is dying and you get that chance to say goodbye and you have that sense that maybe the end of life is coming. I don't know if that's easier so much. But I do know with the IVF that when you sit in the GP's chair and they're talking about sending you for tests around fertility, some part of your head says, this may not be okay. So there's a beginning of preparation there and maybe an anticipation. Whereas with Dara, it was like being hit by a train, the shock.
Can I ask you, when you're working with either the Wexford team or you're working with the Mayo team or any of the Olympians, how do you handle the potential for failure and for loss if things don't go right? Do you try to get the athletes able to say, look, if you don't, here's how to handle it? Or is that anathema, you can't ever go there?
No, I don't think we ever talked about. In my own head, I will always know if we go on this path and we do not achieve what we're going to achieve, then we will kick into gear, we will find our way through this and help those athletes through this. So I know we will do that. But absolutely never, I would never have countenance or never have gone through with them, well, if we don't win this match or if that result doesn't go our way, then what? I definitely wouldn't have done that beforehand. No.
Why? Because it would undermine the aim for success? Is that the thinking?
Because what we're looking for as management and you know, the managers and me as part of the backroom team is you're looking for athletes on the stage, the sporting stage, to be fully present, to be fully committed, to be in that I know we call it the zone, the flow, the state, to be in that state where they can access all the training, all the practice that they have done over time. And to do that, they need to be focused on what it is they're doing. What's my job out there on that pitch? And so that's really where your emphasis goes, not on what will happen if this doesn't work for us.
Well, I asked this with great trepidation as a Dublin man asking Stephen, but I'll tiptoe into it anyway. What do you do then, Stephen, with the teams when it does go wrong? Because Mayo has had some of the most awful experiences where defeat was snatched from the jaws of victory. What do you do with the guys afterwards? Because having spent that much time and that much energy and that much focus and commitment, it is a form of bereavement when they discover it hasn't happened.
Yeah, it's loss. You know, and I suppose the first thing is to acknowledge if you're not hurting, you weren't in it enough. You have to, you know, when you have skin in the game, when you're investing in it, if it's not hurting in those days and weeks after, I think that's your first signal to sort of say something wasn't right. And then I think, I suppose the difference maybe with loss in sport is that, you know, it's a result and it's a moment in time, and you got to accept the result. You mightn't always like it, Anton, but you have to accept it at a point. And the one thing that sort of helped me, but also the players, is that in sport, there's always another day. So during the season, there'll be a game next Sunday. You'll have an opportunity to maybe right the wrongs or fix things. There'll be next season. You know, when one team is playing on that All-Ireland final weekend, there's actually teams working away with next season in mind. But obviously, with bereavement, it's something that's quite binary. It's there, and there's a unimaginable hurt that like I can't even imagine what Niamh was going through at the time when we were meandering through those summer months of 2017. But sport, as I said, it has to hurt. I think that's, and acknowledge that, accept it. But then you look forward and then you try and
do the
plan.
teams look forward with the same degree of passion every time? Does it take something away from them? Does it take some of the drive away, the loss?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just you go back to try and understand the loss, you know. And you look at, and Niamh calls it out in the book, and it's one of our go-to lines, and it is, you control the controllables. You look back at, and in your last question, Niamh said to about the zone. You know, as a manager, as a part of it, you want people to stay in the moment. You don't want them to look at what's the final whistle. You want it the next play. So in that context, it's about now. What can you control? How can you do your role? So then when you try to get over or move on, it's like about, well, what can we do better? Or what can we learn? And that actually can be quite fulfilling. That can sort of say, right, we're taking back control of this, or we're looking now to navigate or put our plan together. So it's and that can be rewarding when you see that 2 or 3 games into maybe the following season. Yeah, this is coming together, and that's how you gain things like momentum.
Has that been your experience as well, Liam?
Yeah, I think loss in GA or in any sport, I believe that you learn more from the losses than you do from the victories. And I think that's a journey, and you're on a permanent journey as long as you're part of a squad. And on that journey, you bring all that experience to bear, and there's new players coming up. And when they get feeling down, their colleagues will help to get them over it. But I think that losing is not a bad thing in sport. In fact, I think it's actually a good thing in sport. But obviously, you want to win whatever you can win. And I think, by the way, that Mayo have been the best team of the last number of years, because given the resources, given what they have overachieved, they have not underachieved. Now, they should have actually done a little bit better if they'd been lucky, and there was a few little mistakes here and there. That's going to happen. So I think they've been fantastic, and I think Stephen did a brilliant job.
Do you believe the same is true about learning more from the losses in a business context as well as a sporting context?
Well, I think in business you're permanently looking at losses, and in business you're permanently looking at stats. Now, I introduced stats into our team, but stats weren't being done at that time. But we got a lot out of the stats, because people started to see the game differently. Because we subtracted scores off of fellas who got scores because they didn't defend better on the other end of the field, and we put that up on the board. So he could get 1-4 and be on -2 points, which Martin Story didn't like on 1 or 2 occasions. But the point is,
and who made the decisions on these numbers, Liam? Did that live entirely with you? Was that the power of God?
No. We had a man recording the statistics, but they don't lie. So when you go into his dressing room, how are you authentic? There's no point, in my opinion, because I used to find difficulty with that. Someone said, you have to do this, you have to do that, and what's that? And you just don't hang together for you. You need an anchor, as they call it in sports science. But the anchor is, this is reality. Don't fret about it, just correct it. That's it. And it's amazing how much that corrects. But you need the mental and you need the stats to work together. And I think that makes a big difference.
How much of this, because we touched on this earlier, Niamh, how much of the fact that you would know this kind of theory helped with dealing with your own loss, or does it help at all?
My own loss felt completely different. I don't think being a psychologist helped me, except that I knew from the start that no skills, no strategies, no techniques, nothing can help you when it comes to loss. You don't
sit and say, I know that this is this is denial, or this is the anger phase, or this is how I process emotions. It's of no use. I
knew, for example, so what you referred to earlier is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did some work around things that people would think about as the stages of grief, and actually that's not what she meant it for. She talked about, she was dealing with those who were at end of life, who were dying. And then I suppose that work became, spread out a little bit. So I knew that there weren't stages of grief. I knew that it wasn't going to be linear. I knew some of those things. I knew that I was a person before I was a psychologist. Eddie Murphy, actually, the clinical psychologist, again sent me a DM on Twitter the day Dara died and asked me if I needed some help, if I needed any help with my caseload or anything like that. And one of the first things, he rang me the next day, and one of the first things he said to me was that piece. You are a sister first, you're not a psychologist now. So the psychology helped me in terms of me understanding that as human beings, we have emotions that are, the joy is an easy one, but we have other emotions such as rage and and resentment and loneliness and jealousy and envy and all of those things. So I probably, from a psychology point of view, helped myself by being okay with those feelings. What often will happen with somebody, you'll see this on the playing field, or you'll see this in life, or you see this in business, is somebody feels something. So I feel angry or I feel anxious. And then they feel shame or guilt about feeling angry or anxious. So I didn't really make it worse. My expression is, if you can't make it better, at least don't make it worse. So I didn't make it worse by giving out to myself or having expectations of myself around the grief. That's probably the only way that psychology helped me to survive.
There's a quote, I think it might be a Beckett quote, that says that it's a line talking about loss where he says, I can't go on, I'll go on.
Yes.
And an element of what Stephen was saying about next year, you've got next week, you've got the next game, you've got something else to focus on. Is there an equivalent in bereavement? Is there a point where you begin to look to a future, or does it never happen?
I think what happens, for me anyway, in the first year, all you're doing is surviving. That's what I would say to anybody who is bereaved. You just survive, put one foot in front of the other and survive in that first year. And it's the first everythings. It's the first birthday, their first birthday, your first birthday, the first Mother's Day. That first Mother's Day without Dara was just horrific. The first Christmas, I actually, we all move in together as a family over Christmas, and we had spent the Christmas just before that March together. And I don't like the word perfect because I think it doesn't really exist. But if ever there was a perfect Christmas, it was it. It was just wonderful. And so that idea of approaching that first Christmas and that empty chair and Dara not being there, I couldn't bear it. So I think in that first year, you're trying to survive all the firsts without them, which reminds you of all the lasts with them. And then I think after that, it just becomes about that little bit by little bit by little bit, you start to accept that she's not going to walk in the door. I'm never going to get to throw my arms around her and hug her. She won't tell me what she thinks of COVID or anything that's going on. You understand that. And then one day, it was actually about a year ago. It was about September 2019, so 2.5 years after Dara died. And Dara had this expression. She might have even said it with you over the years, Liam, because she would have known Liam. And she used to say if you're going to meet her somewhere and she was late, she would text you or ring you and she'd say, you crack on, I'll meet you there. And about this time last year, that expression just kept coming into my head, and I just kept hearing Dara saying, you crack on. And it's as if she was saying to us, you know, you must live your life. You must live your life. I want you to crack on with your life. And I think if grief had a goal, I think that goal would be about the balance between remembering and living. You know, and that's why you mentioned the words that we use in sport about going on or moving on. But for bereavement, I can't use that word. I don't want to go on. I don't want to move on. I don't want to leave her behind me. I don't want closure. Do you know?
There was a couple of things that I thought were interesting in terms of what becomes important when you're dealing with loss. One of the things that you talk about is when your marriage ended, that you wanted to hold on to the house because the house was, through the window of that, you would have seen Dara leaving to go flying, and that it therefore meant much more than bricks and mortar. One of the things that you talk about is deciding to go to the crash site on the Eliethna. Why did you do that?
I needed to see where she died. I just needed, when I leave Mayo, like I feel emotional about both your counties, but I feel really emotional about your county. When I leave Mayo and I leave Blacksod, I cry each time because it feels like I'm leaving her there. She's not there. I know she's not there. But when the Navy offered us the chance to go out on the Eliethna and to bring us out to Black Rock and to just see the seas and see the waters, and those you obviously know that those coasts around Mayo, it's an angry sea. It's a big, loud, roaring, angry sea, and I just needed to see it for myself and understand the geography and to just be there. And there's something about that piece that you were saying, that things take on different meaning. I could have been there 5 years beforehand and that place would have had a completely different meaning for me. But I think what happens in loss, and not just bereavement loss, I think things take on other meanings for you. And especially when somebody dies, you will take any link you can get with them. however tenuous.
Can I ask the two gentlemen, having read the book, were there any elements of it that you found particularly redolent? Was there anything that brought up experience from your own life? I mean, maybe kicking off with you, Stephen, was there any, because as I read through it, you would find pieces where you'd say, yeah, that brings back the way that I dealt with my own losses over the years. Did you have any of those experiences reading it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm adopted myself, so I understand absolutely the whole aspect around what that journey is. Totally different journey than what it was back in 1978. But you know, I can't just imagine the door being closed to somebody. My parents, my mother, I was the oldest of our family. When at a time when they had issues having kids, and you know, I can't imagine that door being closed to my mum and dad. So that sprung to mind. You know, like I've been so many friends, our own experience, myself and my wife, we've had miscarriages, and they're, you know, actually only reading the book, I never thought of them myself up until that time about being grief. And I can remember being at in the hospital, going to what we thought was going to be our first scan, and that unfortunate news. And I can remember a moment driving home telling my own mother and father, it's something that'll stick with me. And I really got it more as I read through the book. And sort
Did you talk about that? Did you talk about it at the time? Because often it's a thing that people feel, we'll keep it to ourselves and we'll say nothing.
I probably didn't as much, you know, because, you know, I felt I needed to be there more for Laura, my wife. And, you know, it was, you know, and it's something that I'd reflect back on now, that I'd be way more comfortable about different losses now. You know, I probably, whatever, 6, 7, 8 years ago, I maybe wasn't as mature. I probably didn't realise where I was. And something now would allow me to be a lot more open. And I think as well, you know, looking at how myself and Niamh actually developed over time, was that we're actually two quite open people. And, you know, it was one of the things that was really great when I met Niamh the first time in Carton House. And then was one of the characteristics was her ability to show her vulnerability. And basically shaking up a room of men to sort of say, you know, this is what you're doing. This is, you know, in a sporting context, this is what you love. Come on, let's do it, you know. And to sort of realize that there's worse things out there, and let's get on with it in a really positive manner. But there's also items in the book, and I texted Niamh last week when she talks about Fionn and Buddy in it, and it was just something that was just so, it really hit me. Our own house at home, we've had dogs for many years, and some of them have passed and that, and the dog nearly becomes part of your family. And
Buddy
again,
being your Lhasa Apso.
Yeah, and again, you know, there was a grief there for Fionn to have to deal with. Poor old Buddy wasn't going to be around. Another part of the legs of his chair was no longer going to be there. And it seems so small, but at different ages, at different points in where you're saying
It's so difficult to explain to a small child.
Yeah, and another part of his comfort blanket is no longer there.
Liam, same question to you. Any elements within the book that struck a chord personally?
I don't know, but like I've had grief in my own life, and you know, it makes a major impact on you, and you learn to live with it. But at the same time, it's always there. It's always present.
For the grief that you have had and the loss that you have had, looking back on it, would you have done anything differently in how you handled it? Now that you look back?
The two big griefs I had was my dad. I was driving in Scotland on about maybe his second or third holiday of his life after his honeymoon. My father was a guard. My mother was a farmer's daughter from North Wexford, and they worked so hard and they did so much for us to put us through boarding school, which, by the way, at that stage on a guard's salary was unheard of. My mother had a business going on the side. I got an Entrepreneur of the Year award. My mother owns it. That's a fact. So the point is that we were on a trip to Scotland, to England, to my brother, and then we went up to Scotland and we had a crash. It wasn't my fault, and it definitely wasn't my fault. It was adjudged to be not my fault. But when the accident happened, I was driving, my father was beside me and my mother was behind. And when we crashed, your first reaction is we're hit by a lorry, and we were pushed back, and it was really, it was tough. So the first reaction was, everybody okay? Everybody was okay. So we jumped out, and I got my mum out, and my dad got, I'm fine, and he went to the back of the car. And my mother and myself were looking at the car and said, oh my God, the good car. My mother was saying, the good car. Oh my God, the car is in bits. Oh my God, what do we do? And I went back, and my father was a smoker, and he was smoking a cigarette, and he said, Liam, don't feel great. And suddenly the car didn't matter a goddamn. Do you know what I mean? Suddenly. But isn't that what the human does? You kind of come down all the time to the last common denominator to be worried about, and then that makes something that looks trivial. But it's just the way we humans work. That's the way we are. That's the way I'm wired. And then my wife got MS in 1995. It was diagnosed the day before Christmas. And I can still remember when I had to tell her.
You had to tell her?
I had to tell her. Well, what happened was I was called to the doctor who had been an examiner in Wexford, a great man and a very, 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 very kind man. So he had to tell me so that we knew exactly before, and it was Christmas Eve, and he was apologising for that. So I didn't tell her till after Christmas. I knew you were a family. But when I told her, I can never forget the reaction, which was dreadful, like wailing, like. And she will never be the same again. And that's loss, So, but on the good side, when I think about my dad, I can cry in the car on my own, and he's dead since 1971. And I can still think about him from time to time because he was a great character. And I can actually cry, but I can laugh about 10 minutes later. I always wind up with a bit of laugh because he was great fun, and he was a great dad. So there's always something in there that you can get something back out of it. But I know when I start to cry about him, it would just fall on you, right? Just out of the blue, when you just think of something to remind you. But I'm crying, but I'm not that badly off because I know there's a laugh coming at the end of it, So it's how you manage it again as a human being.
What year did you say he died?
1971.
1971, so 49 years ago.
Exactly.
And you would still cry over the loss?
Yeah, and not time. I did frequently afterwards, but because I felt, even though it wasn't my fault, I felt somewhat responsible to my brothers and to my mother and to everybody. And that's a natural reaction, you know what I mean? But I'm just saying, I think that's a good thing, that I can still keep him close to me, and I can still maybe have a little cry to myself, and then maybe a few minutes later, I will only do it in the car. I'm just driving along and suddenly think, and I let my mind go into my dad again. And then,
well, that's what I wanted to ask about, because I just personally, and I don't know if this has been your experience with Dara, there are some losses that you have that you effectively keep in a closed box. And every time you even start to lift the lid, you think that's going to hurt too much, and you just close it back down again. Do you consciously think of your dad? Do you consciously feel
no,
I should?
It might be a match. I might be listening to a match on the radio, and my dad and myself and my mother used to go to lots of matches. So it just comes into your head, but I don't push it out, because for the simple reason, I enjoy it, the thinking of him again, even though you're crying. It doesn't erase the great memories that were there. And then you suddenly start to think of all the good stuff, and you get in good form, and you're smiling before you're finished.
Was there any element of that?
I don't know, maybe she needs to analyse me, I don't know.
Oh, I'm not that good, Liam.
Was there any element of that, Niamh, in the writing of the book? Because obviously it's whatever about a couple of minutes in the car where you get to reflect. You had to sit down for hours and days on end and say, I'm going to dwell and dredge and relive. Cathartic positive, cathartic negative?
Cathartic positive, for sure. I would say to anybody who is grieving anything, whatever your way of expression, do it. One of the first chapters in there is feel the feelings. You've got to feel the feelings. And I'm with you, and I'm with you in both your losses. And I think I didn't know either of you were going to speak either of those losses today. And
neither were we, only you made us by
your fault.
Your fault, you just made it. So now
that's the theme for today, is it's Niamh's fault.
Well,
Niamh has that power of being able to do things that you don't know.
But thank you, that's generous of you both. And I'm with both of you in that you it's about being okay to feel those feelings, whatever those feelings are, and to let them come, and to realize that actually we're not going to get stuck in those feelings. We may get stuck if we don't feel them, if we do keep them in that box with the lid on the box and something else sitting on top of it, because they're there anyway. And the other thing I think that's helpful to maybe think about is that actually all those feelings, and the feelings of sadness and the tears and everything, they're linked to love. I mean, if you think about it now, there are people who die across the world today that none of us in this room know, and we will not be impacted by that. But when somebody we love dies, and we know that you won't see their face, you won't hear their voice, you won't sit with them like we sit here, that impacts us. So if you can link in some ways when you're ready and in time, if people can link those feelings of sadness, which I think is what you're doing, Liam, with the love for your father, the love for whoever it is, and understand that they are two sides of the same coin. Does that make sense?
It does. Have you had many people, because I think back to when you would have been doing the regular slot, both in the Ray D'Arcy show and then on mine and then with Neil Delamere. One of the things that would always happen was any time that you opened up and shared and talked about your own personal experience, there would be an influx of others feeling, I'm now safe to talk. Did you find the same after Dara died? Did people come up to you to share their own experience?
Yeah, I think what happened was the day that Dara died, we drove to Mayo, and we were contacted by RTE to ask if we wanted to speak the next morning on Morning Ireland about who she was. Dara the person, not just Dara the pilot. And I see now that we weren't really thinking, so we said yes. I'm so glad we said yes, but we said yes, and the next morning I spoke. What that did was it invited people, because we had shared, and my parents and I spoke to Teresa Mannion as well at an interview, because we had said what it felt like, and we had talked a little bit about Dara. It invited people then to tell their story and to say, I lost my mum, or my brother died, or any of these things like this. And I think that's really important. And again, we don't have to get stuck in it, and we won't get stuck in it, but if you think, we sort of live in a world where, it's Instagram, and it's polish, and it's filters, and it's flawless, and it's, people looking like something. That image that sometimes you see, it's an apple, and we see the front side of this red, juicy, beautiful apple, but the back side of the apple has had a bite taken out of it, and it's oxidized. So I suppose what it has done in speaking out about some of the truth about the awfulness of grief is it allows other people to say, I'm not doing this wrong, or I'm not losing my mind. I'm okay to feel that rage at my loved one for leaving me. That's okay.
The other thing where you talk about other people that I'd be interested in your view and the guy's view, I think people, when they know that somebody has had a loss of any kind, whether profound or whether minor, there is a tendency to say, whatever you do, don't mention the war, don't go near the loss, and if need be, don't go near the person. You almost shy away. Did you find that at all in your own experience? And is it something that you want? Do you want to be left alone? Do you want people to ask you about the thing that is still sore?
So from my own experience, I think the first thing is you must acknowledge the pain. If I met people who I knew would know that Dara had died and they didn't mention it, the psychologist part of me said, that's okay. It's uncomfortable for other people, and I understand that. The person part of me, the sister part of me, wanted to scream and say, my sister has died. Don't ignore it. So I think that's different for everybody. That was my experience with it. And I do think it's important to acknowledge that pain. And when people say, I'm afraid to say something to somebody about it, I'm afraid I'll upset them, they're already upset. We're already upset. You can't upset us. And those tears, if we weren't living in a time of a pandemic there, Liam, I'd have hugged you. And I want to hug you, but I can't hug you. But those tears, he knows they're okay. We know they're okay. We're sitting here, we're okay. And I think more times people need to know that if you do speak to somebody about their loss, and if they do cry, it's okay. In the dressing room in Croke Park, and I write about this, we had the Kerry replay. We had played Kerry again, and we got ourselves into the All-Ireland final. And I came back into the dressing room, and Stephen said his few words, which were amazing, and the joy and the shrieks and the whoops of the team, I'll always remember it. And then the boys go into the showers to change, and I can hear the water and the echo in the room. And I was in the warm-up room, the warm-up room in Crook Park with the AstroTurf. And I just started to cry. And I cried. It was the first time I'd cried, I didn't, in front of anybody, say, in the team. And I cried and I cried and I cried. And it was that eyes running, heaving, cannot stop crying tears. And some of the players found me and hugged me. And of course, the more they hugged me, the more I cried. And Tom Parsons, who's about 10'4", huge guy, and he just grabbed me and he hugged me and he looked down at me and he knew what was wrong. It was because my brain was so happy at our win, but it was so sad because Dara isn't here to share this. And he just looked down at me and he just said, she's here, she's with us. And I honestly nearly broke in that. But I had to, as a psychologist, say, well, on one level, it's really bad that you have let your emotions go in your place of work. But the other part of me had to say, it's okay. And that's what I mean. It's okay to let those emotions out.
On the less profound end of the spectrum, what happens in a sporting context? When you've had a loss, do people shy away? Because you think about the bus coming home with victory, you rarely get a bus that says, well done lads, it was a good shot. Mm.
Yeah, I've had too many of those buses travel to Mayo. Yeah, I think, there's an aspect around you're not looking to address it in those first couple of days. It is too hard, and you're sort of, you're not looking at the reasoning.
But do people come up and sympathise? Do they say anything? Does that make it worse if they do?
I think people, I'll always remember the hotel aspect of the night of an All-Ireland. You'll be on two different sides of Dublin. There'll be one hotel be going mad with a piece of silverware, and you'll have another part where it's anything else, and people will. I don't know if it's the right term to sympathise, but people will, I think respectfully they want to say, well done, and I think I have to say for our own team, they left everything out on the pitch in 16 and 17, and in some ways that allows you accept and be able to move on and sort of say they did their best, and you don't. I don't know if the word is even that you get over it. I think I might have said that. You adapt. Tuesday comes, and Wednesday comes, and lo and behold, you're 1 week down, and again you're moving on. And it's certainly, and not to run them as a parallel with bereavement. It's a case of surviving in those first couple of weeks. And the topic changes then, and
I think
go back to work and you sort of adapt on.
You realise, I think, that you failed, but you're not a failure. That's when you asked me earlier about the psychology piece. In time, when the feelings have to be felt around the loss in the beginning days, and I remember being on the train going back down to Mayo, and I, with the team, and I composed a message to go on the WhatsApp group to the players, and it took me probably an hour of that journey to get that message right. And, there's a time to look at it all in perspective and lessons and learnings. The end point that you want to get them to get to is, well, we failed, but it doesn't mean that we are failures. And it does hurt, it really hurts. And I do think some people are really uncomfortable with it. And I think that's a great point, that I think sometimes people stay away from you because they don't know what to say to you.
And well, in that context, because, and I think, Stephen, you made the point of comparing bereavement with other forms of loss. It is worth restating that while bereavement is a central theme in the book, it is not the only loss, that it does go wider than that. In a business context, Liam, because you started, early 70s in the...
74.
74 in the hotel business. You went through...
I started in the hotel business when I was 12 with my dad, and I think I'm going to have him up for abusing me as the chap. He'll tell me I made you hardy. But anyway, look, I'm in a sense, I was actually reared in a kind of a house that always had guests. My mother turned a house we had into a guest house as well. So I was well aware of the industry for all at that time, and I was in Shannon Hotel School.
And you went through probably the toughest time of, I was going to say the Irish hotel industry, probably the hotel industry anywhere in the world, because around the 2008, 2009 bit, with Niamh and with everything else, hotels in particular took a profound kicking for a number of years. What was that experience like? How does it compare in terms of the stresses and the losses that you would have dealt with in a sporting context and other contexts?
Well, look, it was like everything is cyclical. I mean, I've seen the bank strikes back in the 80s. I've seen various things. So there's always been a period when you were under pressure. Always. Is that a bad thing? No, not necessarily a bad thing, because it makes you toughen up and it makes you pay attention to the job. Because if it was all plain sailing, we had a yacht out somewhere and living out, that's not for me. I want to be at the coalface working myself. And
would it not be nice to have the yacht on the weekends, maybe?
No, it was the weekends, yes. No, but anyway, we won't go there. But from my perspective, we learned an awful lot. But the mistakes that were made by way back in the early part was the one that I was really annoyed about, because before the crash, we created, I know Goldman Sachs actually, we were really lucky here that Goldman Sachs collapsed as well, because otherwise it would have been down to ourselves where the system was gone, and the lack of attention to detail at a governmental level in relation to tourism and the industry, which hasn't actually improved much. You just hope to think that it's going to get better now after all of this, because you can't keep crashing everything forever. But at the time, you're worried that you're going to lose it. You're worried about your family. You're worried about your staff. You're worried about the long stairs that are working with you for years. So you're carrying a lot on your shoulders. But I think, you know, if you stay focused and you have a plan and you can get down and look at it and do it. And my sons were back in with me at the time, two of my sons, and they were very committed, and they're effectively running the business now. So we were ready for it, and we were ready for the fight. And instead of waiting, we went to the banks straight in and said, right, we want to talk here. You know, this is what we can do, this is where we are, where we do. And we found that was very good to kind of get in there early and talk to them. And to be fair, the banks were very good with us at that particular time. And we worked our way through it. But you know what? We didn't deny it. We didn't walk away from it. We didn't start blaming all these things in retrospect, even though you had a few nice curses in the bottom of your mind when you were driving a car around. Right, and when I remember my dad was encouraging me to curse them into the ground, but I don't know. So you know,
I was going to say, your car is a very interesting place to be, Liam.
Yeah,
there's a lot going on in there.
It's my only place of quiet. But anyway, so you eventually, through the hard work, get through it. And I think no matter what it is in life, if you work hard enough at it, you'll find a solution. If you lay down and let it happen, it will happen.
That thing of taking control, where Liam says, go to the banks early, in that instance, in a business context. Likewise, the next match, the next day. How important is that for dealing with loss? How important is it to cross the Rubicon and say, I'm going to get back in charge? And for those losses that are so deeply profound, how do you do it?
I think it's really important. I think we need to be, with the car analogy, I think we need to be in the driver's seat with loss. It feels that we are kidnapped and put in the boot because it's so overwhelming. But I think understanding that there are some things you can control. If it's a bereavement loss, you can't control that person. They're never coming back, and you can't control that. But you can control whether you listen to your feelings, whether you lean into your feelings. You can control whether you focus on that one thing that you wish you had done when they were alive and you didn't do. You can control, do you focus on that, or do you think of all the times you had that were lovely times? There are things like that that are in your influence. You can control whether you take the help that a lot of people offer. People are lovely. One thing I've learned with loss is the kindness of strangers and the kindness of, you know, people who are already in your life and they want to help. And so you can control whether you let somebody help. And that might be get your shopping, your food shopping, or it might be, there's a beautiful little expression that says, if you cannot look on the bright side, I will sit with you in the dark. If you have people in your life who are okay to sit with you while you cry, then you are rich. And so you can control whether you have those people around you and whether you let them in. And I think, yes, it is important to, and control maybe is the wrong word in this context, but I think we know how I mean it here. I think it's important to understand that while loss it's horrific, we do have some things that we can do to help ourselves that won't take away the pain. It won't take away the pain, but it might help us navigate the journey.
Final thing then, folks, either from tell me the truth about loss from your own experience. If you're advising somebody to deal with loss, Stephen, what would you say?
Yeah, it was, you know, if you were to look at loss as being the enemy as such, the analogy, you know, the opposite to that would be that you must live your life. But that there's a time period that it'll be different for everybody, but that at some stage you will have to accept it. There will be seek support. That can be professional, but it might be your friend and family. It might be whatever it was, and then you'll adapt. But there's always hope as well. Like, you know, I would always say, you know, and I think one of our first conversations with Niamh is that myself, when I look at a glass and it's half full, I always see it as being half full. You know, and I think that's where you have to be. That out there ahead, there's hope, and that's the way you have to move on.
Final word to you, Niamh.
I think to anybody dealing with loss, and you know, as a world, that's what we're dealing with now. COVID brings losses in terms of death. It brings losses of income. It brings losses of identity, loss of the life we had, the freedom, the choice. So there's grief, really, whether it's named or not, is widespread. And whether it's that or bereavement loss, I'd say to people, it hurts more than anything else in your life. And it will hurt, and it will tear you inside out, and you will feel that you're losing your mind. And it might hurt you physically. It will hurt you physically, emotionally, maybe financially, cognitively, socially, every way. But there will come a day where you will learn to live with that loss. And it's not about getting over it or closure or anything like that. It's about learning to, exactly as you've said, both of you said, accept the loss. Because I can spend my whole life wishing that Dara didn't die. I can spend my whole life wishing that I was a mother. I can spend my whole life wishing that my marriage was still there. It's not going to change anything. And when I think of the efforts that Dara made to get out of that helicopter to get to the surface of the water, she didn't make it, but she would give anything to have her life back. She'd be so angry at me if I wasted my life. So one of the things I'd say to people with loss is when you feel the feelings and you feel the hurt and you find the way to accept and live with that loss, to understand that actually, as both of the men here have said, there is a place of hope where you can have a life after loss. It's not the same life, and believe me, you don't want that life. You want the one you had. But actually you can have a life, a really good life. So hold on to that hope.
As I said, Niamh is going to be answering questions on #TellMeTheTruthAboutLoss straight after this. So if you want to ask any questions to follow up on anything that's been said, Niamh will of course be available. Big thank you to Stephen, to Liam, and of course to the author of Tell Me the Truth About Loss, Niamh Fitzpatrick. Congratulations on the book, Niamh. It is a hugely revealing and very raw story of loss and losses. Thanks as well to Eason's for partnering with Gill Books on this event. And of course, Tell Me the Truth About Loss is available to purchase at their stores nationwide and at easons.com.